Good afternoon. I am Andria Derstine, the director of the Allen Memorial Art Museum, and I'm delighted to welcome you for today's talk with Annie Storr. I'd like to thank Jill Greenwood, Liz Earsley, and Megan Harding of our Education and Communications departments for their work publicizing today's event, as well as Emily Cole and her team at the college's alumni office. I'm particularly pleased to welcome Annie, who is an alumna of the Oberlin College class of 75, back to Oberlin, even if virtually, to speak with us about her research relating to the founding of the AMAM and the motto over the museum's main entrance. We have been in touch during the past several years about her thought-provoking work, some of which she first presented at Oberlin during her most recent reunion in 2019. Annie Storr is resident scholar at Brandeis Women's Studies Research Center, where she is working on a cross-disciplinary study of Hull House co-founder Ellen Gates Starr. Annie has devoted her career to exploring the intersection of art history, pedagogy, and social engagement, which led her to Starr. Prior to her work at Brandeis, Annie was founding chair of education studies at the Corcoran College of Art and Design in Washington, D.C., and head of education at the American Alliance of Museums, among other positions. She has been a museum educator for more than 30 years, encouraged by AMAM curator Catherine Watson, having started her career post-Oberlin at the Winnipeg Art Gallery. She created the guided looking method Exercises for the Quiet Eye, and Ragdale Art Colony in Lake Forest, Illinois has awarded her a 2021 Francis Shaw Fellowship to complete her book on this method. Annie is widely published in interdisciplinary journals. She was the first educator to become a National Museum of American Art postdoctoral research fellow. Her dissertation on the intellectual history of gallery tours, traced back to the 18th century, led to a U.S. Department of Education National Graduate Fellowship. Later, she represented the museum field in the first federal policy paper on lifelong learning, Building a Nation of Learners. Please join me now in warmly welcoming Annie Storr, whose talk is entitled "The Cause of Art is the Cause of the People," Ellen Gates Starr at Oberlin College. Hi, Annie.
Hello, hello. So thank you so much for that very gracious introduction. It's very nice to be. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Today's story is yet another proof, if we needed one, that whenever you start to research one subject, you never know where you're going to end up. And in particular, where I have ended up, at least for this chapter in the life of Ellen Gates Starr, is back on the steps of the museum and the art department that turned me as a freshman from being a government and economics major into an art history and religion major. My heart and my intellect belong to the Allen Memorial Art Museum, so it's wonderful to be back here. My research and the project that I thought I was doing was, as an art historian and an art educator, or a historian of art education, was to try to find out what had happened to the art schools, which at its founding were very much a part of the Hull House settlement house in Chicago. There were just too many conflicts in how it was described, what had happened to the arts at Hull House, and what kinds of educations were provided and to what kinds of students. I started that process and discovered that there were so many errors in the life story of Ellen Gates Starr that I was first going to have to clean up some basic biographical information about her. And so this array of photographs will show you how my project has enlarged from something that relates probably most to the third photograph to reconstructing a very unexpected biography of Ellen Gates Starr. Somewhere about the point of the second photograph on the left, where you see her working with her bookmaking tools, and the third photograph from the right, which is a candidate's brochure for her candidacy as the alderman in the Socialist Party in Chicago in 1916. Between those two photographs, approximately 25 to 30 years, one of the central relationships of her life was an intellectual and fond, though distant, relationship through letters with her friend Charles Wager. And as we will see, that's one of the reasons we come back to Oberlin. Ellen Gates Starr had one motto her entire life. She spoke it in lectures to students in the Extension College program at Hull House, to working women who would come listen to her art lectures after a day in the factories. Her motto was, "The cause of art is the cause of the people." And I have to admit that if I had ever known that that was what was inscribed across the front of the Allen Memorial Art Museum, I had forgotten until the letters in the archives of the Ellen Gates Starr papers at the Sophia Smith collection at Smith College reminded me. Now, I got interested when I came to Oberlin to check on a couple of things about a visit that Ellen was purported to have made possibly in the late 1890s, possibly around 1920, to Oberlin College. There were also some passing notes that she had lent some books for an exhibition. That was specific. That was 1917, but there was no record of that exhibition at all. 1917 rings a bell because between the years 1915 and 1917 was the period when the Allen Memorial Art Museum was being built. So, armed with a few factoids from the archives at Smith College, some archives at Hull House, and a few references that I had learned about over the phone with archivist Ken Grossi, I came to Oberlin, went into the papers, and firmly told Andria that I had discovered an exhibition that she did not have a record of at the Allen Memorial Art Museum, which had occurred in the spring of 1917. And though she offered me very good coffee and we had a wonderful conversation, she did point out that the Allen Memorial Art Museum, a Italianate Renaissance small masterpiece by Cass Gilbert, hadn't been opened until June of 1917. So the exhibition to which Ellen Gates Starr probably maybe had loaned some books couldn't have been. And then I saw the yearbooks in the archives after lunch that day and thought, the cause of the art is the cause of the people. The cause of the art is the cause of the people. It's everywhere around all of the announcements and proud newspaper articles about the art gallery. So had to turn around this paradox. How could we have an exhibition at the Oberlin Art Museum? That was the description, which was prior to the museum opening and for which there was no record. And I turned through the archives some more that day and found this record of that exhibition, which not only tells us that it was, as rumor had it, an exhibition of arts and crafts objects, but that second line down under leatherwork was indicated that Miss Ellen Gates Starr of Chicago had lent her books to the exhibition. How could this be? Well, across from the King Classroom Building and across from Peters Hall on Tappan Square, there was once an art department and an art gallery building. And in the process of this project, and with some added information and facts that Ed Vermew and Ken Grossi and Andrea have been able to supply, we discovered that before the Allen Memorial Art Gallery, there was another art museum of Oberlin College, described as that, and that it existed in the art building in French Hall, which was built in 1868 and not demolished until 1929. Now, I at that point pictured that Ellen and some other arts and crafts artists had offered or sent or brought their works of art and laid them out on some tables in the art building until this description of the art gallery, which housed right across that second floor of French Hall, turned up in the Oberlin archives. Oberlin Art Association, organized largely through the efforts of Professor CB, that is Charles Martin, has been contributing a great deal to the life of the college. An exhibition room has been fitted out in French Hall at considerable expense. The walls are covered with burlap and are lighted with a system of indirect illumination, which is remarkably effective. A person well acquainted with museums said recently that it was the finest exhibition room between Buffalo and Toledo. Now, if in your homes you're laughing, don't laugh, because those references are very particular, very specific, and quite ambitious. Buffalo had just built its Albright Knox Art Museum, architect Edward Green, as part of the Panamanian exhibition for 1905. And he had also designed the Toledo Museum of Art, which had just been finished when this notice was written in 1912. So we have a modest, Oberlin-like, unfancy, but very up-to-date, fine art gallery on campus. And that's where the Arts and Crafts exhibition occurred. To put this in context, we need to think about who Ellen Gates Starr was. Well, she was the co-founder with the more famous and later Nobel laureate Jane Addams of the Hull House Settlement, which was a locally based community living model of service to beleaguered industrializing cities and their poorest of the poor, which Jane Addams and Ellen Gates Starr decided to form after they made a trip to London and to Europe in 1887 and 1887 and 1888. They had been friends at that time for about a decade, having been classmates at what is now Rockford University, then Rockford Ladies Seminary, or Women's Seminary in Illinois. Jane graduated and got a bachelor's degree. Ellen was not able to afford it and moved instead to Chicago, where she became a teacher, specifically an art teacher, and a teacher of art history in the Kirkland School, the most elite girls' educational institution in Chicago. They had promised each other a trip to Europe, and almost a decade later, they made that trip. Both of them were struggling with what to do with their lives, what to do with the education they had, and what to do with the staleness that had begun to come into Ellen's teaching. Before we go ahead, let's think about what Hull House was. I've put up as just a visual display an array of some of the people who were regular officers, teachers, and particularly resident social workers at Hull House. And without going through them all, I think regardless of what your particular area of interest is, you're going to find one of the American heroes in your field among the staff and residents of Hull House in the 1880s, 90s, and into the early years of the 1900s. Look at that array. From the very start, the arts, the experience of art, the gainful training of art as a field for making a living, art appreciation and criticism were all core to the social settlement house in Chicago. Look at this early old picture between Ellen on the left and, Jane on the left and Ellen on the right, both in pictures taken about the time that they established the settlement. The colonnaded house in the front, that's the original building of Hull House. It housed a creche, that is to say, what we would call a daycare center. You see it on the right, decorated with high quality reproductions from Raphael and other Renaissance masters. And on the left is the labor museum and the Museum of Craft, which was one of the resources for both work and prideful sharing of culture that was created for older immigrants coming into Chicago who could bring their skills and show them to the public. But this picture of Hull House is very important because after the first building, a borrowed, abandoned mansion house, the very next building that was built, and you see it on the left with the polychromy, brickwork was the Butler Art Gallery. Now, these women and their gathering group of volunteers were delivering babies, assisting people with no access to hygiene to find housing, places to get clean. They had what we would think of as a precursor of an Alcoholics Anonymous. Most of their work was nitty-gritty human services. And the first addition they made to Hull House was the art gallery. This says something about the importance of this aspect of life in the institution. To go back a picture, excuse me. Right, I've lost a picture. In an institution that eventually was 16 buildings on 4 city blocks, serving sometimes thousands of people a day with food, legal needs, medical needs, socialization, education, everything. So here are just a few views of Hull House to give you a sense of how integrated visual art was and the other arts as well. There were 2 theaters, one proscenium, one more like a symphony hall. There were art studios. By 1892, 3 years into the founding of Hull House, there was an art gallery in which Ellen Gates Starr mounted exhibitions, mostly taken from loans from the collections of some of Hull House's increasing coterie of very affluent supporters, sponsors, and volunteers. You see the Labor Museum. You see murals by John Duncan, a great national painter of Scotland, above in the theater on the left, landscapes, earthenware, ornaments, plaster casts. The arts were everywhere and in most buildings at Hull House. This was not their idea. They adopted it with the whole concept of a settlement, a center where middle-class educated people did not come in and take over for people who had special social and economic needs, but rather a coterie who would come and live in a community, learn from the residents what needs were and how the residents of a settlement could become neighbors, could become facilitators, and could participate in an interactive way with the residents of the community. This idea, here's Ellen and Jane at about the time they first made their trip to Europe, they got when reading a clipping, Jane urged that they both go back through London on their way home and meet Samuel and Henrietta Barnett, who had just a few years before established Toynbee Hall, a originally denominational Church of England and now independent social service organization, which still exists a century and a half later in the East End of London. Part of Samuel and Henrietta Barnett's plan was that there would be art classes and an art gallery embedded into any settlement house, along with its soup kitchens and its clothing rooms and so on. The art gallery at Toynbee Hall just happened to grow up and become the Whitechapel Gallery in the East End of London, a very important contemporary art gallery. But it was started as a service for the experiential enrichment of the lives of the children and adults in the absolutely destitute East End and late Victorian London. I've tipped in at the bottom one of many, many influential participants and frequent speakers at Toynbee Hall, who is the artist, social thinker, leading socialist in London, William Morris, and he will be part of our story throughout. So William Morris may or may not have met Jane Addams and Ellen Gates Starr when they came to London on that first trip. He was there quite frequently. One of his studios was not very far from Toynbee Hall, and he was very close friends with the Barnetts. Whether or not they met him then, they certainly knew about him because the curriculum back at Rockford Ladies Seminary had been rich in the writings of the contemporary and recent English progressives, Thomas Carlyle, for instance, and above all, John Ruskin. John Ruskin and William Morse's name go hand in hand together, especially in their influence in America, as two men who looked at the need for humanization of the way we treat the bottom 2/3, 3/4 of our modern economic industrialized society. They both were smart, urban thinkers, urban planning thinkers. They gathered salons around them. They were allies in their causes, and they wrote on the aesthetics of the arts, the human role of the artistic experience, on what kinds of design and art would be fulfilling and wholesome and enriching for human beings to live with. And in the case of William Morris, as we'll read a little later, this pushed him into the thinking of the early socialists in London. And he was, while being an artist, while being a highly successful entrepreneurial businessman of interior design and the arts, made him the founder of the Hammersmith Socialist Society. He began a very famous book press called Kelmscott Press, whose volumes today typically sell in the tens of thousands of dollars, a handprint book press, which published the classics of English literature, Chaucer, Shakespeare, and so on. As part of his press, he had a book bindery, and the theory of bookbinding as a meditative form of art and craft for the maker, as one that gave a maker a sense of the satisfaction they can receive from doing good work, and can make the reader value and cherish the contents of the book all the more because of the labor that the bookbinder has endowed upon the text as a kind of exemplar for high-minded values. Down below his photograph, you'll see one of his pamphlets, the publication of a lecture called Art and Socialism, which he delivered to the Secular Society of Leicester, England. Typically, he lectured to working class men and sometimes working class women, members of unfancy guilds, undereducated but aspirational workers in the cities, trying to raise their sense of a life beyond the drudgery of a factory with dehumanizing effect of the factory. In the case of Art and Socialism, he delivered this lecture to a middle class, we would call liberal or progressive-minded audience in Leicester. And this text was published almost immediately in 1884. And then again, in the multiple volumes of William Morris's writings published by his daughter 2 decades after his death in 1915. But it was a well-known text. And we know that Hull House prided itself on owning in its library for general public use, quote, practically everything ever written by John Ruskin and William Morris. So here, a quotation from Art and Socialism. I admit that to get it on one screen, I have squunched down 2.5 paragraphs so that you get the beginning and the end. 300 years has not changed man's nature thus utterly, that is to say, 300 years of the Industrial Revolution. One day we shall win back art, that is to say, the pleasure of life, win back art again to our daily labor. Where is the hope then, you may say? There is our hope. The cause of art is the cause of the people. Within a year of the opening of Hull House, Ellen Gates Starr was lecturing in regular evening courses repeated over and over again on John Ruskin, on William Morris, on both of them as thinkers, writers, and artists, on Dante and contemporary Florence, not something you generally associate with the late Victorian period or the early progressive era in America. But Ellen Gates Starr was fluent in Italian, and many of the immigrants who lived in the neighborhoods around Hull House, recent immigrants near the stockyards, were Russian, Polish, and Italian, and she had the language. She gave a course on ancient architecture and then looser discussion groups on the history of art for young women coming in from the factory for a cup of tea and a sandwich to discuss art. And she did it year in and year out. Here are 3 of the lectures that she gave in these art history courses. They are unfortunately undated, but the one on the right talks about the comparisons between John Ruskin and William Morris in their lives and their influence. And the one over on the far left, if you look very carefully, is a biography of Morris onto which has been added in a different ink, William Morris, Art and Socialism. So these lectures, these intellectual enrichments were part of Hull House from the start. Ellen's interest in education, and particularly the education of the underprivileged, was experimental, and she tried all kinds of things. Just all the time. She became the first president of the Chicago Public School Art Association, which made sure that there were original works of art in the public schools of Chicago. And this institution, under a different name, still exists. She was invited to the Chautauqua Institute to teach in 1895 its first course on art history and criticism. And she also lectured and testified on the importance of art in every person's life. At the Chautauqua Institute, she met fellow faculty member Albert Stanhope Cook, who with his wife became very close friends. She told a terrific story about how when they went off riding, she, who normally lived in a house with dozens of residents, would crawl into their bed, gobble bonbons, and read Browning. But one of the people that she met that summer was Albert Stanhope Cook's prize graduate student, Charles Wager, who after his PhD went on to become the professor of English at Oberlin College. What you're looking at between them is a copy of Stanhope Cook's masterpiece, which was a translation of a 9th century early Christian treatise, bound by Ellen Gates Starr. The friendship between Wager and Starr began at that point, and carried on in letters for 25 years. But it was Albert Stanhope Cook who encouraged Starr to take some time off from the drudgery of her Hull House work and to go back and throw herself into the arts. He encouraged her to go back to Britain, and in particular, to go back and to join the Dove's Press and Press Bindery run by T.J. Cobden Sanderson, William Morris's dear friend. She goes in 1897 and 1898 and 99, gives herself a sabbatical, arrives having not actually been told she could come, and became the only full-term apprentice of this master bookbinder and publisher. If you know the story about the hand publishing press madman founder who took his type and threw it in the Thames River rather than have his partner get it after his death, that's T.J. Cobden Sanderson. She stayed for 15 months. You see her very first book up above with marbleized paper. The text is nothing significant. It was a working book. And then below, a copy of A Dream of John Ball by William Morris, which, as the note inserted in it indicates, was the book that T.J. Cobden Sanderson considered her masterpiece, which allowed her to consider herself a master binder and to return to Chicago to start a book bindery at Hull House, which she did. These are examples of her work. One of her students, Peter Verberg, is with her in the studio, and then another of her students and some of her student work. She had elegant ladies and young people working a trade that they could make a living with. Peter Verberg was a working class kid who went on to be the head of his department at the Cranberg Institute of Art. Look closely at this picture, because William Morris's most recent biographer of our generation says that in the inner sanctum of the founder of the Hull House bindery was furnished with almost everything to make it a Morris shrine. This photograph of her studio shows some of the loose test pages from William Morris's Kelmscott Press Chaucer. And if you look very carefully over Peter Verberg's shoulder, the curator of the William Morris Society has helped me identify which portrait of William Morris is photographed in a frame behind him. She was considered the most public-facing, most devout promulgator of William Morris's ideas in practice in America. Oops. So the letters and the friendship with Charles Wager started about 1895. By 1900, he was trying to get her to come and lecture. They wrote hundreds of letters to each other. Fortunately, hers survive and his were sent to her papers. So we have the double correspondence. They wrote about religion, about art, about the doubts of the usefulness of their lives, about middle age ennui, about depression, about commitment, about who they should be reading and whether they should be reading different people to remain idealists in a tough world. There was only one break in their correspondence from the late 1890s until Wager's death in the late 1930s, when for 3 years he did not write her. The 3 years during which she became a very public civil disobedient advocate for the workers, especially working children and working women, and was arrested so many times that she had to check on her calendar whenever she made a commitment for her different activities. Her speeches, her spokesmanship of Hull House, for her summer vacations, whatever, she had to check her court dates to make sure that she was free to attend. And in April of 1916, having become a socialist through her labor organizing, she ran for alderman of the 19th Ward, the ward of Hull House. She lost profoundly. She got 10% of the vote, but she got 10% of the vote against the mayor's hand-picked incumbent alderman. And she was endorsed by every single newspaper in Chicago, regardless of its political affiliation, because of the high stature that she was held in for what was by then 20 years, 25 years of work at Hull House. This was too much for Charles Wager, and he simply went silent on her, hurt and unsure of what to do. Around Christmas of the third year, January or so of 1917, she sent him one of her treasures, her own edition, her own copy of the Kelmscott book of St. Francis's Meditations called the Fioretti, the Little Flowers of St. Francis, which she had bound by her hand. And she sent it to him as a gift, hoping to break the ice. By the middle of February of 1917, they were apologizing to each other, he more to her. And by the end of February, he was inviting her to come to Oberlin. By the end of January of that year, this exhibition we've spoken of the arts and crafts was well underway, and she had not been previously included in it. But she was inserted in and asked to bring many of her bound books from the Hull House Bindery, her own work as exemplars, to add to the exhibition. And she was asked to lecture twice, once on the subject of bookbinding as a craft, and once on William Morris. She did so. She sent the books ahead. But when she arrived at Oberlin, think about Oberlin and its student and faculty makeup over the years. When she arrived at Oberlin, she was already all of these things. Now, I'm not expecting you to read small print, but there's so much. She had co-founded the most famous settlement house in the world. She had taught and lectured on art history and criticism, theory of knowledge and pedagogy for over 25 years. She had moved in the most progressive intellectual circles in both Britain and the United States. She had just campaigned for alderman. She just spent the winter right after her defeat with Samuel Gompers organizing the AFL laborers in New York. As she was invited, she again had to check her court dates to see if she could come, but she could. She was recognized among Chicago's most radical political leaders and also one of its most respected public intellectuals. She maintained a revered position in the arts and crafts movement. She had a national place in the labor movement. And incidentally, she was deeply involved in the Anglo-religious social evangelical movement called the Oxford Movement in England, and the Companions of the Holy Cross, a Anglo women's social service organization in the United States. So she was all of these things when she came. Quickly, what we know about the exhibition is mainly from a single paragraph which describes some of the work that was in it. 25 pieces of Favril glass sent from the Tiffany furnaces on Long Island. This was not a local collection show by any means. These examples may not have been in the exhibition, but they are all examples from Tiffany that were made, were fashionable and had just been designed, made in 1914, 15, 16, 17. They would have been current exhibit pieces. The grandson of Charles Grandison Finney had recently left to the college a collection of Rookwood arts and crafts pottery, which we know were exhibited. This is the few things we know. There were interior decorating, pottery, tiles, and other architectural decorations from, I can never say it, Pewabic pottery, examples of throneware from the Cowan pottery in Rocky River, Ohio. And no, those particular gates by Samuel Yellen were not exhibited. Those are the gates which, if you've gone through the art museum, are there today. But there were others examples of Samuel Yellen's iron work exhibited in the show at French Hall. And on April 13th, during the exhibition, the college contracted him to make the ornaments, the wrought iron ornaments for the Allen Memorial Art Museum. There were other bookbinders, Berea Crafts Textiles, embroidery by Lydia Bush, a variety of arts and crafts jewelry. And though we have not yet found any of the specific books extant, she wrote us this letter to tell us what she was sending ahead. Shakespeare's sonnets from Kelmscott, a variety of mostly Asian literature. And apparently she chose them because of the unusual designs, the more modern designs. A variety of books, mostly Kelmscott or The Dove's Press of T.J. Copton Sanderson. And I think because there is an anomaly, there's a missing book in the list that there may have been exhibited, The Little Flowers of St. Francis, that she had given Charles Wager. Before we go too far, I just want to say that in the college collection, there is a Kelmscott book, the Praises of the Blessed Mary the Virgin, published by Kelmscott Press and bound by Ellen Gates Starr. It did not come to the college until later, but if you want to see an example, here it is. On April the 16th and 17th, she gave her lectures. They were pre-published as Bookbinding and on William Morris. They were delivered in Sturgis Hall, another building now on the site of the conservatory, which was also demolished around the time of French Hall. And then here's the chain of events. And this will just help us finish up. In December, January of 1916, December, January of 1916 into 1917, Cass Gilbert, the architect, and President Henry Churchill King of Oberlin College were in correspondence with the donor of the Allen Memorial Art Museum, Susan Spencer Allen, discussing what inscriptions ought to be across the building. By March of 1917, there was a deadlock involving each of these figures and also the Arts Interest Committee, later called the Oberlin Art Association, which was given responsibility for choosing the august words to put across the front of the museum. On April 9th, the exhibition opens. Ellen was not there. She was planning to come later. In fact, she was planning to come on Monday the 16th, Monday the 16th in time to deliver her lectures. But instead, she moved up her arrival and arrives about the 10th or the 11th. On the 11th, the Art Interest Committee, which has been deadlocked, you can see the frustration coming out of the pages of their minutes, meets again to come up with an inscription for the front of the building, because if they don't have one, it will not be up in time for the opening of the museum in June. On the 12th, the committee notifies President King that the committee has come to a unanimous decision, and it is not any of the highfalutin, air-filled, Beaux-Arts kind of icky mottos that had been suggested and suggested and suggested and just kept stalling out. Later in the evening, on April the 12th, Starr is the guest of honor at a dinner party involving the committee and many faculty and the president and others. And the next day, President King confirms that the college has decided unanimously that the motto that shall go across the front of the museum is the maxim of William Morris from Art and Socialism. The cause of art is the cause of the people. 2 days later, she comes up to the podium, and her lecture is no longer about William Morris. It's on William Morris, Art and Socialism, a topic and the title of the piece from which the motto came. And the next day, after most of the principals had departed, she gave a talk on bookbinding. That was the reverse order of how they were scheduled. It looks as if from the calendars we've been able to check that the lecture she gave on William Morris and his maxim, and the source of the maxim, was moved up so that more of the people who were there for the opening week of the exhibition, for the committee's meetings and so on, could attend, and that lecture could be used as an explanation, a rationale for this highly unusual, famous socialist maxim to go across the front of the Beaux-Arts Allen Memorial Art Museum. 8 weeks later, on June the 12th, the museum was dedicated with the inscription that had just been carved in time, and the rest is history. I know I'm over time, but I know that we care about whether there's an influence in the teaching at Oberlin and at any college. In the audience that night were a junior named Eleanor Grace Clark, who went on to be professor of English at Hunter College, and a lifelong friend of Ellen Gates Starr. She was her caregiver when Ellen was invalided in her late 70s, cared for her in her apartment in New York City in the late 1930s while friends figured out what to do after she was paralyzed. She wrote the obituary published in Commonweal, the major national magazine of Catholic thought, read by non-Catholics as well, in which she tells the story of how Ellen Gates Starr would get up before every talk she gave at Hull House and say, "The cause of art is the cause of the people." Also in the audience was a sophomore who was forced by his father to leave that radical school and go finish at Yale. But it was Thornton Wilder. And Thornton Wilder went on to be a friend for the rest of his life with Ellen Gates Starr. He looked back upon Wager as the most important teacher he had ever had. And in the late 1930s, when Wager retired in ill health, it was Thornton Wilder who wrote the commemorative poem to his former teacher and who sent the drafts to Ellen Gates Starr to help him edit them and to get just the right tone. I apologize for being over time, but it's quite a story. I just want to remind you the similarity of the ideas that flow from Morris to Oberlin to Starr. These are articles and essays written by all of them, and the motto of the college, learning in the labor, in the light of art and socialism and art and labor. Thank you very much.
Annie, thank you so much. That was
Sorry,
just
I took too much time.
No, it's wonderful. I think you had everyone wrapped in the audience, and I know I'm just so excited that you're able to tell this story publicly in this forum and in this venue, because it is truly fascinating. I love obviously the history of the Allen, but to make all of these connections, it's super important. And I think for many of us at Oberlin, I think for many people in the audience, but probably not everyone, Oberlin College really has this long tradition of service. People do know it as a progressive institution. The motto of the college itself is learning and labor. And I think there are so many connections, that you've drawn, and just even more general connections as well, between what happened at Hull House, Ellen Gates Starr's philosophy of life, and the sort of philosophy of Oberlin College in 1915, 16, 17, and certainly still to today. So I think it's wonderful that you've drawn these connections. We do have a couple of questions, and I will read. I'm just going to go through a few of them with you. We have a few. So one question, a very kind of particular question. You had talked about how Ellen Gates Starr ran for that alderman election, which she lost. Were women allowed to vote in local elections in Chicago in 1916?
Yes, and in 1916 was the first election that the state of Illinois allowed women to vote.
Okay.
Ellen ran because she wanted to make sure that the women that she worked with, who thought they could be voters, would see that a woman could also be political. I mean, she did this as a kind of an exemplar. And we have the letters that show that she was part of an organization, I've lost its name now, which was testing in practice whether or not women would be allowed to vote. And
wow.
Yeah.
I mean, it's also perfect to have this now in this year, given, well, I guess now we're in 2021, but 2020 is the centenary of being able to vote. The person who wrote the question did note that in school board and local elections in Massachusetts, women could run for office and vote before 1920. So, so that's terrific. And then, we have a couple of comments from folks who are just so appreciative about the talk in general and warming their heart to learn about this sort of socialist history, socialist adjacent history. Another question is just how many places do you know of that?
May I break in just one quick moment?
Sure.
I think that issue, the sort of what is the politics and the spirit of the college, they were looking at a really important kind of identity crisis or evolution to move from French Hall as your art gallery to the Ellen Memorial Art Museum was part of a much bigger project of President King and Cass Gilbert to make Oberlin more of a mainstream, elite, impressive school that could attract upper middle class students. It was testing whether it was going to stay that radical in the same way.
Absolutely.
And in that last image, I should turn off the screen.
Oh, no, that's fine. That's fine. So just another question. You obviously beautifully showed some examples of Ellen Gates Starr's bookbinding. How many, generally speaking, how many places have her books and have most of them been identified, or is that like a big project still to do?
I hope that Barbara Blumenthal, recently retired from the Mortimer Library at Smith College, is listening. She handed me her own transcribed copies of the T.J. Cobden Sanderson letters at Smith between Ellen Gates Starr and her master teacher. And we bonded a friendship. It turns out that Barbara not only worked in the rare book room, but is a book artist, a bookbinder and book artist, and has an historical bent. And we have agreed to work on some kind of a catalog resume project. I'm working on her life, and Barbara will help me take over working on the books. The most recent find, spectacular find, is that I've found an Ellen Gates Starr binding in John Ruskin's personal library of one of his own novels in the last year of his life, given to him as a gift by his friend T.J. Cobden Sanderson when Ellen Gates Starr was his apprentice. But they are, we have at least one in about 45 libraries.
Wow. Okay. A couple of more questions. Someone says here, was the Metropolitan Museum in New York's 1905 decision to launch a new educational mission at that museum influenced by Hull House? Did Hull House ever undertake traveling exhibits like the Met conceived of in 1913 and then in the 30s and 40s?
Well, as a history, I mean, I'm a museum educator, so that's actually another part of the history. Probably not, except in the sense that several English galleries like Whitechapel, like the Victoria and Albert, were increasingly seen as not just design museums, but as art museums, which had a core educational mission. So that movement was working in parallel. And actually, once the Art Institute of Chicago got going, where Ellen ran committees and ran exhibitions, the Butler Gallery gradually retrenched and became more of an interactive labor museum and display space for the work of the community of Hull House. So it started out as the only game in town before the Art Institute was founded. And that's where you went to see an art exhibition, was at Hull House. And then its role became more of a service gallery after that.
Okay. And even a couple more questions. Someone says today, what, if anything, resonates today in terms of the importance of art, the handmade process, versus machines then and technology now? So what resonates today with the handmade process?
Oh, heavens. Everything. I mean, the idea that if you are running behind a machine, you're not a human. If you are using tools or a machine to lead the process, then you're a creator. And that for a laborer, for a person making, for an art maker, that's the difference. simply a tool in the process, or are you the mind and the spirit that's creating? And the issue around 1890 to 1920 was about gainful and paid work and whether it would be done in an affordable way. Nowadays, I think we all understand the importance of being able to feel worthwhile because the work that you make is quality and is an expression of yourself to some extent. But whether that's the task that you carry out during the day to earn your living, or whether that is something you do in really serious lifelong art making or craft, to me is somewhat less important. I'm not sure how viable it is to make mass-produced commodities by hand, able to make a passing living on it. This has troubled Ellen over time.
Okay.
That doesn't mean it's the only way you can make art. And there were actually 6 different art schools at Hull House, some of which were manual factory training, some of which were what we would think of as Saturday classes for kids.
Sure. Okay.
Others which were sort of enrichment programs for, night school for working class people and ladies in lace to meet together and paint. Everything.
Okay. And we have 3 more questions. One I think is a quick one, and then 2 maybe a little bit more expansive, or actually maybe more. But let me see. The quick one is this: what was the name of Ellen's student that went on to the Cranbrook Academy of Art?
Peter Verburg. It's spelled a variety of ways, but the most common is Verburg. And it is variously described that he was the head of the manual department, the head of the book department, the head of the press, and the head of the design department. And unfortunately, Cranbrook has very, very few archives left. I'm going to try again, but they sort of know that name was there and they don't really know much about it.
Okay.
He's a Dutch immigrant.
Okay. Thank you for that. Here's one too. The idea of art for the people. Do you think the Bauhaus in Germany, which was founded in 1919, their idea to provide everyday functional art for people was influenced by Hull House, or was this just generally in the air by 1919?
Oh boy, that gets really complicated, but the simple version is that settlement houses of the English model were proliferated all over the world. I mean, there were 1,800 settlement houses in the United States about this time. I mean, after Hull House, it burgeoned. There were dozens in England and so on. There were very few in Germany, and I don't know why. So if there was an influence on the Bauhaus, then it was around these progressive institutions that perhaps its faculty visited or knew about, but the same system didn't quite exist. It is not an accident that when the Bauhaus had to leave Germany, it went to Chicago. And there were second and third generation principals of Hull House and the University of Chicago and other progressive institutions, which helped that happen. So on the later end, Hull House was involved.
And just one more question, and this has been just super fascinating. How much easier would it have been to get involved with bookbinding as a professional occupation in Starr's time, in juxtaposition to today's climate around, quote, the usefulness of the craft? How do modern attitudes towards art making reconcile with historical attitudes towards Starr's work?
Really interesting. I know some book artists and taught with several at the Corcoran. When I was there, let's see, book arts are now more fully integrated and recognized as an absolutely definitely fine art, associated with ideas not only of excellence of craft, but of self-expression, of innovation, of avant-gardiness, again, with very high levels of craft. So book arts, whether it's binding or altered books or book making, is closer to any other fine arts expressive form today. At the time, book binding and book making, because they didn't just decorate them, were natural for Hull House and for Merton Abbey, William Morris's studios, because they were crafts, they were techniques that were fulfilling in themselves, not necessarily deeply self-expressive. So their role within the art world is in a different place. In general, it was found that women who took up leather work, which originally meant lovemaking, might find greater satisfaction if some of their labor using the same materials became decorative bookbinding, also purse making. And it's interesting that Ellen Gates Starr, with a local friend who was a glove maker, formed the Women's Leather Making Guild at Hull House, which became the first women's union in Chicago. So, in a sense, the leather work, and notice that that's the phrase used in the exhibition, that she was a leather worker, that book binding was the upper and gratifying end of working with leather, which would have often been for garments and accessories.
Okay. Actually, one more question came in, and it's sort of interesting because it goes in a new direction, but I think it's a really interesting question. Do we know of Ellen's attitude toward modernist movements in Europe, such as Cubism, Expressionism, and Dada at that time?
Yeah, we do. Was it Churchill who said, "I disagree, but I defend to the death the right of this person to have a different opinion"?
Yep.
She was also a religious seeker. This is implied in her correspondence with my description of her correspondence with Charles Wager. All through her life, she was integrating her personal practice and her calling to teach and for social improvement and for equity work. It was a religious calling, and she moved from what we would think of as a sort of independent country church in Northern Illinois through different gradations of first Congregationalism, then Episcopal Church, the Anglo-Episcopal Church, high Anglican, and then became a Catholic in 1920. By 1913, when the Armory Show comes to Chicago, her head's going in another place. Right? She's becoming more inward, and she thought of her art and her teaching more and more explicitly as a kind of religious gift.
Mm-hmm.
And I think she would have said, those are sort of interesting, odd things those people are making. But it would have seemed irrelevant to her, not negative, but irrelevant.
Okay.
Say that one of her closest friends and her co-founder of the Arts and Crafts Society in Chicago, Laredo Taft, was considered one of the wasn't an arch conservative, but the arch resistors of modernism.
Interesting. Thank you, Annie. Well, I want to thank you so much for sharing this really important research with us. We look forward to seeing it published and hearing more about it. And I also want to thank everyone in our audience for joining us today. As you all know, many of you know, we, of course, pre-COVID had all sorts of in-person live events at the museum. Were we all together, we would be traipsing off to the East Gallery for some snacks and drinks and questioning Annie in person and enjoying a lovely time together. We very much on the staff look forward to doing that again with all of you when the time is right. But Annie, again, thank you so much for sharing all of this with us. And I just want to thank Jill again, and I want to thank our audience. And we look forward to seeing you at the next Allen event. Thank you.
Thanks so much for the opportunity. Bye-bye.
Bye.